Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
On October 27, 1985, when I went to the store, that was the last time I've been home.
An innocent man exonerated after 29 years in prison.
Imagine being in this room for a week straight without any human contact, not speaking to anyone.
New gains in the fight to end solitary lockup.
I know this is the first time this ever happened.
A president takes on mass incarceration. Guantanamo gets new scrutiny, but no action.
Most of us were once foreigners.
And the American entitlement of birthright citizenship comes under new fire.
I was right on it.
A look back at the year in justice. Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and the PSEG Foundation, making things better in our communities.
From the Black Lives Matter movement to a move at last towards drug policy reform, the growing recognition that something's terribly wrong in our system of crime and punishment, and a major victory in gender equality. 2015 was another big year in justice, and our challenge, again, was which of the issues we covered last year just had to be included in this short half hour. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and we start our annual retrospective with an issue that is still unresolved and still making news as recently as last week. What to do about Guantanamo, exposed last year for the first time from the inside by a detainee still imprisoned there.
Bring me to the court and I'll answer all of your questions, I would tell the team. There will be no court, they would answer.
The words belong to Mohamedou Salahi, still isolated in Guantanamo.
If you read his book, you see that the only information they received was when he said yes, when they tortured him.
That book began 10 years ago as Salahi's way to tell his story to his lawyers, and he just kept writing.
It comes in at about 122,000 words, 466 pages, handwritten in English.
Improbably, the chilling memoir did get published, and to critical acclaim, but only after a 6-year fight for the government's okay. Still, even with redactions, Guantanamo Diary is a chilling account of the torture that George Bush insisted did not exist.
I want to be absolutely clear with our people and the world. The United States does not torture.
In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We tortured some folks.
The result, Salahi's harrowing first-hand account.
This is the first account published by a still current detainee.
The human rights community, too, has circled around Salahi. The ACLU's been a long-time part of his legal team.
He clearly is not a threat. He just wants to go home. The government just has to turn him loose, which is what they should do.
But Raymond, after 14 years, Mohamedou Salahi is still at Guantanamo. He's now one of 93 being held there, the smallest number since the camp was opened, and yet the president, despite his insistence as recently as last week in the State of the Union that Guantanamo needs to be closed, has not been able to do it.
The president's been plugging away, but it's still a quagmire. The numbers are greatly down. It's been a total of 700 or more that have been through there, 500 when he took office. It's down now to 93. But take Slahi. Even though the courts have said he can go and the administration wants him to go, the president's own Department of Defense has said now they want to undertake a review. So there are constant obstacles. Add to that the fact that with respect to the next 40 or so, he's going to have to negotiate in a very charged diplomatic environment.
Getting
with other
countries to take 10 at a time, 5 at a time.
Or maybe 1 at a time. And there's the congressional ban on moving anybody to the mainland. Now, there's a constitutional question about whether that really applies because the president's commander-in-chief, but that just invites a potential legal challenge, which would slow him down even more. So I would say the odds are against him, but he seems determined. He even mentioned it in his last State of the Union address. He seems absolutely determined to close this. And there's sort of a double message that we've talked about, which is him saying he doesn't want to leave it behind for another president to have to deal with.
And the question is, presumably he's hoping that will be Hillary Clinton. Will, in fact, it be a help to her? And what about if it's not Hillary Clinton? You have a theory about what he really wants to do.
I think his real message there is he doesn't want to leave an opportunity for someone on the other side of the ledger to rebuild it and keep it open. So he would very much like to get it resolved, maybe even give it back to Cuba. I don't know. But I think he's serious about this, but he faces significant obstacles.
President Obama also last year urged an end to the excesses of the war on drugs, the draconian sentences, the over-incarceration of nonviolent offense, and he underscored his pitch with an unprecedented visit to a federal prison.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I know this is the first time this has ever happened.
A dramatic way to underscore his call for meaningful criminal justice reform.
Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. In far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime.
Just one day earlier, he'd commuted the sentences of 46 federal inmates, all serving long, hard time for nonviolent drug crimes, most involving cocaine base or crack.
I believe these folks deserve their second chance.
And though the president's freeing of just 46 may seem largely symbolic in view of the massive numbers imprisoned, the 6,000 later cleared by the Justice Department for early release will have wide impact. And it's only the beginning. The U.S. Sentencing Commission changed the guidelines again last year, and their retroactive effect could ultimately mean less time for as many as 46,000 federal inmates, nearly half of those in for drug crimes.
The United States will never be able to prosecute or incarcerate its way to becoming a safer nation.
It's what former Attorney General Eric Holder calls a sea change in the country's approach to drug crime and over-incarceration.
Sandy, I think over-incarceration, like Guantanamo, is a legacy issue for this president. I think he's very concerned about the race effect and very concerned that we really, in contrast with much of the rest of the world, just incarcerate tremendous numbers of people.
All of the rest of the world.
That's right, all of it. And often for crimes that don't warrant this kind of punishment.
He says the punishment often does not fit the crime. He's the first president who's ever said anything like that. Who's conceded that we make these mistakes.
And reversal of a trend that really started with Nixon, of increasing emphasis on wars on crime and wars on drug. Even the metaphor has been difficult. And now all the branches are sort of engaged. You have the executive branch, which has, the symbolic significance of the president going to a prison. You have the release of people who are under review by Justice Department, maybe 6,000 people, maybe more of those to come.
They say 36,000 could be next.
That's true. And you've had now in the Congress a bipartisan bill, which while it doesn't satisfy all the president's supporters, at least will reduce the number of mandatory minima and will eliminate 3 strikes and give judges great discretion. But there's more to be done, and how much farther the president can push is an open question.
Hillary Clinton said in the last debate that we've got to start moving drugs from a criminal problem to a health problem. And yet we saw Bill Clinton as part of that same trajectory from Nixon to Bush.
Bill Clinton, as part of the Democratic Leadership Conference and their strategy, I think, of moving to the center, supported the death penalty in his own way and really increased the incarceration rate. So Hillary says she's her own man, and I think on this issue she's going to be tested because she does seem to be indicating in the campaign that she's acting in a way or thinking in a way consistent with President Obama.
And how close do we get to really eliminating the problem of over-incarceration, mass incarceration, and for the wrong crimes? Everything that's being looked at here and talked about is very much a half measure.
I think maybe, and this is, I hate to say this, it's going to be the next wave in which we're able to do that. As long as there's controversy in criminal justice context, the hard line always win. We've pushed as far as we can, probably with this bipartisan bill, and it may be that, for example, eliminating mandatory minimums, going back to greater discretion for judges on federal crimes, and really changing the way the guideline system works with respect to drugs is going to be tough to complete this time around.
Well, we actually saw some rare bipartisan cooperation on the questions of drugs and over-incarceration, but this is an election year, and among the GOP field, refugees and immigrants have been squarely in the crosshairs, with Donald Trump and Ted Cruz both going so far as to urge the deportation not only of the undocumented, but even of their citizen children.
It's not just the birth certificate and the Social Security number. Everything comes with birthright citizenship.
It's a fact. You're born on U.S. soil, you are an American, whether your parents are here legally or not.
That's a constitutional right.
A right accepted as common law since the founding, but enshrined in the Constitution after the Civil War with the ratification of the 14th Amendment.
It's inherited. It's in our Constitution. We always believe that everybody who is born here is a United States citizen.
But could that constitutional guarantee be challenged?
As a policy matter, Megan, it doesn't make any sense anymore that people who are here illegally, that their children would have automatic citizenship.
And could a challenge be successful?
The 14th Amendment, I was right on it. You can do something with it, and you can do something fast. You can do something fast.
But what's brought cheers in some quarters is being met with anger and fear in others.
If they revoke my citizenship, which I don't even know why they will, where would I go to?
Back to Cameroon? His mother, an undocumented immigrant, left there 24 years ago.
I came here for better life because they say America is the land of freedom.
As Pope Francis reminded Congress,
most of us were once foreigners.
Raymond, this is the most anti-immigrant feeling that this country has had in our lifetimes.
I would use the term xenophobic if it didn't take us out of our journalistic stance, but
well,
I think it does apply.
I think in this case it does. I mean, look at the Republican frontrunner who has started this whole question of birthright. Ultimately, does this wind up at the Supreme Court, or is it such a non-issue that, in fact, it never gets there?
Well, if we'd had this conversation 7 months ago, I would say it's a non-issue because it really wasn't huge debate in the legal community or in the policy world. I think Mr. Trump and to some extent Mr. Cruz and others, Senator Cruz, have raised the issue to a point where there's likely to be some action, and there is a split of opinion. The case on which most people have relied is 100 years old, and it actually involves two permanent residents who were citizens or subjects of the Republic of China, and actually not the Republic, of the Empire of China, and whose child was an American by birth. So one could make the distinction, as lawyers frequently do, that the issue of undocumented people having a child is a separate question. So legally, there's enough room there for if the president acts, the new president, in a way that consistent with his rhetoric, and if that's Donald Trump or Senator Cruz, there would be a legal challenge, and I think the Supreme Court might have to decide that.
The current president has moved not on the question of the citizen children of undocumented people, but on the undocumented parents of citizen children, trying an initiative, which so far has been blocked, trying an initiative that would in fact give some access to becoming legal to those people. Just today, we see that the Supreme Court is going to take this case can we expect that anything can happen between now and the end of the president's term?
This is a tough one. If the Supreme Court acted in the president's favor by April, there'd be a little time for the president to enact the program. But the truth is, the Supreme Court added an issue that is, in addition to the issue brought to it by the parties, of saying it wanted to know what the party's position was on whether the president had exceeded his constitutional powers. That's not a great sign for the president. So all in all, this program looks like it may very well be blocked for the duration of his term and maybe until the Congress acts.
And this court has not been real enthusiastic about the idea of presidential overstepping.
That's true. And I think that issue, combined with the fact that, as we say, we think the court tries to decide issues on their legal merits, but as the old saying goes, the Supreme Court reads the headlines.
Birthright, nonetheless, ensconced in the Constitution. But another practice around for almost as long is also being challenged. It's solitary confinement, which got action in New York last year and at least a hearing in New Jersey. Solitary, we have some idea of how awful it must be from all those times we've seen it on screen.
I'm in a cement box and people are screaming.
You needed a little time out to think about your behavior.
From the edgy TV of today to the classic Count of Monte Cristo, or closer to home,
put this man in the hole. 90 days.
The Trenton-based tale of Hurricane Carter.
Away from me.
With Denzel depicting the hell of isolation.
God.
More extreme than what you'd find in New Jersey today? Most likely.
There is no such thing in the state of New Jersey. This is not Shawshank Redemption where the guy's locked in a box and somebody opens up the door 30 days later and the sunlight comes in.
But those who've been in solitary insist it is still no less than cruel and unusual.
I was going crazy in there.
Terrell Blount now works on inmate education and reentry. But at 19, he was convicted of robbery, sentenced to 6 years. A violation of prison rules put him in solitary.
Imagine being in this room for a week straight without any human contact, not speaking to anyone.
Solitary is torture, they say.
It's like being buried alive.
So anything less than shutting it down is not enough.
Sandy, your report focuses on New Jersey, but indeed New York is also acting on this issue. And internationally, there's something called the Mandela Rules, which have also considered it. So there's a new legal and psychological focus on solitary. For the proponents of eliminating solitary, no good news. We're talking about limitations, but they are serious limitations.
In fact, it was interesting. The first day when New York first passed this, you had headlines that said, solitary gone in New York. That's not true.
No, it's not true at all. What they've done is, first of all, maybe the most important is that only important infractions, rule infractions by inmates can land you in solitary, not minor infractions.
And for a limited amount of time.
And for a limited amount of time. So limitations on what can get you there and how long you stay. Because it's just increasingly becoming a factor, an understandable factor, that this does extraordinary damage to the human mind and to the ability of an inmate to correct his behavior while still incarcerated or when he gets out. I know you've had some interesting thoughts about the origins of solitary and
which started with the Quakers, who wanted to create penitent people who would come out and be good Christians and, in fact, be productive members of society. In fact, we see just the opposite. The experts tell us that it only makes you worse. Whatever you go in with, you're going to get worse.
And now Quaker organizations, the Friends, for example, being very active in challenging
the
solitary.
Most active group we've had representatives on this program, the most active group in fighting against solitary.
But there is a tremendous web conversation going on and a real deep inquiry into whether or not solitary is an entirely negative factor. And over time, if the security argument can ever be overridden, there may come a point when solitary disappears. But that day hasn't come. In fact, there's even discussion about saying, well, no, we don't do it like they did it in the Shawshank Redemption, so maybe we can do something.
Well, New Jersey, in fact, claims, although there are well over 1,000 people in some form of segregation in New Jersey, that we don't have solitary anymore. It's kind of like, during the Vietnam War when it was suggested that, in fact, the president should just say, we won. Well, we do have solitary. And Ray Lesniak, senator, has legislation pending that would do something like what New York has just done. Any chance that we could possibly see success?
It looks like this administration is not likely to support that. And in fact, New York still has a way to go. There may be further litigation going on. This is the result really of an agreement, which is very interesting in its dynamic between two sides of the debate on solitary.
And Raymond, if solitary makes you cringe, imagine what may be the most frightening aspect of our criminal justice system, that sometimes we get it wrong. Convict and imprison the innocent, and sometimes for decades. We found yet another tragic example again last year.
Imagine hitting these frantic New York streets after 29 years locked up. You confessed.
Yes.
A confession the Brooklyn DA now says was at best improperly induced, more likely coerced.
You were beaten.
Yes, I was beaten by the officers.
16 years old.
16 years old.
David McCallum and his friend Willie Stuckey, two scared high school sophomores who didn't even know how to drive, confessing to carjacking, kidnapping, murder, because police allegedly told them they'd go home.
That's what they told you, right?
Yes, exactly.
Just tell us what we want to hear,
yes,
and you can leave.
Yes.
And after a quick and dirty trial with a court-appointed lawyer he had met just once, who mounted next to no defense, McCallum, like Stuckey, was off to state prison. His friend would die of a heart attack 16 years in, but McCallum would remain confined for nearly 3 decades.
On October 27, 1985, when I went to the store, that was the last time I've been home.
The last time till last October, when Brooklyn DA Ken Thompson, 10 months on the job, said nothing tied McCallum to the crime except his false confession. A Supreme Court judge agreed McCallum was free after 29 years.
We don't believe in being self-referential and self-congratulatory, but we started this program 20 years ago with a program about innocence and looking very carefully at what is, I think, the one thing that probably everybody agrees upon. You don't want innocent people convicted. But how you get to reach that objective is a very complicated story. And at least the stories of David Shepard 20 years ago and David McCallum show at least a few bright lights.
And they had several things in common. They were black, they were poor, they had ineffective counsel, and perhaps most important, or at least equally important, they were both teenagers. Teenagers who had absolutely no dealings with the system, didn't know what were their rights, and really got railroaded. In David's case, 12, 13 years. McCallum's case, so much worse.
Now, it's unreasonable and too academic to say that there's a pedagogical value in these cases, but in truth, the whole innocence movement has also been trying to shine a light on the whole justice system. So, for example, if DNA exonerates a person, shouldn't there be more DNA used? If we see that a confession is faulty or an ID that's been tainted, doesn't that mean we have to re-examine how we do those things? So to a large extent, the innocence movement, in part led by Barry Scheck, who's a friend of mine, we went to law school together and who's been a frequent guest here, have been pushing in the direction of saying, every time there's a man or a woman exonerated, it means there may be others who fell victim to the same ineffective assistance of counsel, bad science, excessive prosecutorial zeal.
Yeah, and I think that Barry's contribution is even greater than he often gets credit for, in that he has made the DNA exoneration, as you say, an example of how bad things really may be, and has taken Mr. and Ms. Middle America saying, well, if you're in prison, you must be guilty, having them question, well, maybe it's not so. And that, therefore, has led to real progress on capital punishment.
Right. As well as on other areas that are not so much wired into hard science, but memory, which is an important science, has gotten a real boost into the system by the Supreme Court's examination of eyewitness identification and how it can be tainted by many other things. The court took a quantum leap forward. Science is being engaged in ways it wasn't before. So the exoneration movement is not just, and I hate to use the word like just, about the exoneration of people who really didn't do it, but about looking more deeply into the flaws that exist in the very human system of criminal justice.
And there is now, at least, which there wasn't when David Shepard first got out, there is now some compensation from the state. and that makes a big difference. It doesn't make up for losing 10, 20, 30 years of your life, but it makes a difference.
None of us would take a dime for a day, a week, a month, or a year unjustly incarcerated. But you're right. States have now begun to pass statutes which will give some compensation for people who've been wrongly incarcerated.
And despite his nearly 30-year nightmare, McCallum's story had a good ending.
Like what may have been the justice story of the year, marriage equality for the entire United States. And who better to explain it than the civil rights lawyer who fought and won the case here in New Jersey? So we close with some wisdom from Larry Lusberg.
It's so amazing to think back on this past year because people already forget that by far the largest civil rights victory maybe in our lifetimes occurred this year. And that was the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell making same-sex marriage a constitutional right for all Americans. Here in New Jersey, it didn't seem like such a big deal to us because we had won it almost 2 years before under our own New Jersey state constitution. But today that's the law of the land, and it reflects such an extraordinary change in the way we as people view others. I mean, just 10 years ago, this would have been almost inconceivable. But the change that has occurred as a result of different legal developments, as a result of the way people view each other, has truly transformed the civil rights landscape, and that's what's embedded in your question, but also in the way our world really is today.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.